afternoon. My name is Dave Norton from Discovering New England History. I'm going to present to you episode 2 of the Andersonville Prison, New Englanders that were captured by the Confederacy and placed in the Andersonville Prison during the Civil War. And we're going to tell their story. And those are, in the next slide right here, we'll begin with part 1. Okay, from our last episode, we covered Private James Strawn, how he was at Cold Harbor, and he was captured with several other soldiers when they were trying to fill all the canteens with water for the Union forces. And that's the actual creek there, Bloody Run Creek, they called it. So Private James Strawn, Private William Walker, and Private David Dean, all from New England, as a sample I'm taking right here, were all captured after Cold Harbor. We'll go to the next slide. And they were all among the 1,800 Union prisoners that were captured by the Confederacy, loaded onto boxcars and sent to Andersonville Prison down in Georgia. And I just have this here. Here's an actual picture here that I have. It's been in the family for a long time. And that's James Strawn. We're lucky to have this, and lucky that the family and others have preserved his story for history. So we're going to continue on with the next slide. Now, we're going to talk about the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry. They were mustered in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And 3 soldiers we're going to talk about: Private Caleb Hunt, Private Patrick Carpenter, and Private Andrew Durfee. Now, if you see a star next to one of the soldiers, a red star, like Andrew Durfee, it means he was captured, sent to Andersonville, but he survived. And that's a typical, what the cavalrymen would look like. That's in the Rhode Island Cavalry. We'll go to the next slide. And this is one of my favorite pictures. That's actually a photograph of the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry Scouts. Now the Scouts, they sent them out way in advance just to make sure, find out where the enemy was, that type of thing. They would infiltrate some of the towns before even the Union even attacked. So you can see, as far as the Scouts, they didn't wear uniforms as such, so they could blend in with the local population. Very, very hazardous job. And that's a picture. It's too bad we don't have all the names of those soldiers there. We'll go for the next slide. And there's a great picture there of the cavalry, 1st Rhode Island Cavalry. And during the war, when they started off, the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry was chasing Jeb Stewart and his cavalry, Confederate cavalry. So you have Private Caleb Hunt, Private Patrick Carpenter, and Andrew Durfee. They were all really good horsemen, and they were all part of the cavalry. Here we'll go to the next slide. Now, they all fought in the Battle of Brandy Station, which is in Virginia. It's amazing here. Not too many folks know about this battle. It's the largest cavalry battle in the Civil War. June 9th, 1863. And all 3 of the Rhode Island soldiers participated in that. And you can see that picture there. It's just hard to comprehend about this battle. We'll go to the next slide. Just to give you some statistics, the Union Cavalry, 11,000 soldiers. That means they had 11,000 horses, and the Rebel Cavalry, 9,500 soldiers. That's a lot of horses to be clashing with. And Union casualties were at 907, and the Rebel casualties was 523. And the result of that clash at Brandy Station was a draw. No side definitely won it. We'll go to the next slide. And now they, all 3 of those soldiers survived Brandy Station. So we're moving along now in October 12th, 1863. White Sulphur Springs, I'm calling it West Virginia because at that time it was part of Virginia, and then right at that time is when they broke away and had a separate state called West Virginia. So we're calling it White Sulphur Springs, Virginia. And the whole idea, the Union objective, was to destroy bridges on the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad. Any bridge that crossed a river or whatever, they were going to destroy. And of course, on the Confederacy, they were going to prevent it. And the leader of the Confederacy here was a fellow by the name you may recognize, Colonel George Patton, Confederate States of America. He was on the Confederate side, and he has a very, very famous name in history for the United States. And of course, the first Rhode Island Cavalry, they met and they clashed right here. It was a Confederate victory, and 30 Union soldiers were captured. We'll go to the next slide. October 13th, only lasted about a day, and Patrick Carpenter and Andrew Durfee were the two soldiers that were captured of the 30. And of course, that's Patrick Carpenter's headstone in Andersonville. And there's one of the bridges. It's an actual picture taken on the site, one of the railroad bridges that the Union was trying to blow up. And we'll go to the next slide. Now we continue on. One soldier left, of course, that we're discussing is Private Caleb Hunt. He's also from Rhode Island. And we're talking about the town of Warrenton, Virginia. And this was on November 13th, 1863. And this is an incredible story in history. We'll go to the next slide. Now, we're going to talk about famous Confederate soldiers, and Warrenton, fellow that was born there, is Colonel John Mosby. And interesting, his nickname was the Gray Ghost. And of course, this town in Warrenton was a preferred site to capture because a lot of the rail lines went right through it. It was a railroad depot. And of course, during the Civil War, that's what you want. You want to shut down the enemy's chances of getting supplies and everything and by the railroad. There's this picture up there on the right. And that's his house where he lived in Warrenton, Virginia. We'll go to the next slide. And this is a famous picture. He was, they're called Mosbys Raiders. And that's all they were, just a group of, there they are, the picture right here. But they were incredible. They were scouts for Jeb Stewart's cavalry. And their mission was to recon Union positions, disrupt Union supply lines, destroy railroad bridges, and capture Union soldiers. And the amazing thing about these, it was all from the area where they were all grew up from. So they knew all the people, all the townspeople, everybody in all the towns around that area. And they would disappear. They were famous for making a quick, rapid strike on a town, getting whatever they need, capturing or destroying railroad bridges, whatever they had to do. And then they would completely blend in with the local population. They would change their clothes and whatever like that. And go all different friends and relatives' houses. They fed them, they did everything with them like that. And there's absolutely no way that the Union could ever capture Mosby. So we'll go to the next slide. And this, this is quite a story in folklore. We're going to go back now to a place called Fairfax Courthouse, Virginia, March 9th, 1863. And Colonel Mosby had a raid. Once again, he had a small group, middle of the night, raided the town. And if you take a look here, believe it or not, this is a New England story. If you take a look here, Fairfax Courthouse is that first picture on the bottom. And that's where they, in the middle of the night, went into the courthouse. And who they're looking for Well, one general that was there for the Union held the town, was his picture's up there on the right, General Edwin Stoughton. And believe it or not, he's from Chester, Vermont, a New England fella, and he graduated from West Point. Now, he wasn't at the courthouse. And so Mosby was, I've just attacked the town, I've got to come back with some trophies or something else. And somebody told him that he used as his headquarters the house on the right, General Stoughton's headquarters. So in the middle of the night, Mosby went up the stairs, up to second floor, and General Stoughton was sound asleep in bed. And the amazing part of this story, this is hard to believe, can you imagine this whole town was Union controlled with the soldiers. And Mosby with a small group, maybe 25 to 30, snuck in the middle of the night. And now Mosby himself goes up on the second floor, and he startles the general, and he wakes him up, pulls the covers down. And of course, the general doesn't know what's going on there, you know. And this conversation is actually part of history. It's pretty interesting. I'm going to read you what happened here. He pulled the covers down, and this is General Stoughton. He's startled. He gets up in the middle of the night, and he was indignant. Who were you trying to do this in the middle of the night? This better be something special. So he said, "Do you know who I am?" And Colonel Mosby said, "General, have you heard of Mosby?" And General Stoughton said, "Yes. Have you caught him?" He figured that it was in the middle of the night. That was very significant, and that's why they woke them up. And Colonel Mosby replied, "Have you caught him?" "No, I haven't caught him. I am Mosby. He has caught you." So he captured the general and took him on horseback and rode out of the town. That's an interesting story, especially the general from Chester, Vermont. He was actually the youngest, one of the youngest generals in the Union Army. So we'll go to the next slide. And there's Jeb Stewart. There's his picture. And here's this Warrenton, Virginia, November 13th, 1863. And that's what the railroad depot looked like. Very important to control this. So Jeb Stewart had a raid. So we'll go to the next slide. And it turned out to be a Confederate victory. He captured the town. And there's a picture on the top. He also had Colonel Mosby with him, because Mosby was his head scout. And they captured 300 Union soldiers, along with Private Caleb Hunt from the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry. And they were all sent down to Andersonville. And so it was a tremendous Confederate victory early in the war. And that's an actual picture of the town. So we'll go to the next slide. And we're going to move right along here to July of 1863. Another famous gentleman that, especially with Andersonville connections, is Private Dorrance Atwater. And he's from Terryville, Connecticut, but for some reason he joined the 2nd New York Cavalry. They were recruiting there close to New York, and that's where he was. And he was stationed down, his first assignment was on Hagerstown, Maryland. And there's a picture of Hagerstown with the Union sentries on guard. And that was another important supply depot for the Union Army. So we'll go to the next slide. And there's another great sketch of the town. You can see it. All the Union Army stored, everything they needed, all the food supplies, all the weapons, everything like that was right here in the town of Hagerstown, Maryland. We'll go to the next slide. And that's where he was, Dorrance Atwater. And there's another great picture. It's called the Hagerstown Mill. This was in July of 1863. So the Confederates attacked the town. We'll go to the next slide. And there was the General Jubal Early was in charge of the Confederates. And there's a picture there. You can see the town has now been captured. They captured Hagerstown. it was a big, once again, early in the war, another Confederate victory. We'll go to the next slide. But this is different. Now, Dorrance Atwater did not go directly to Andersonville. When they captured him here, they sent him down to a place called Belle Isle Prison, which is in Richmond, Virginia. And that's a great spot there. A railroad center, original railroad tracks. That's called the Hager House. Great piece of history. So we'll go to the next slide. And I took some of these pictures here, the Confederate prison camp of Belle Isle. We're going to talk about that a little bit. He was confined in there for 5 months. And it was an island in the middle of the James River in Richmond, completely surrounded by water. And you can see that's probably at the lowest point, but you can see all the rocks and everything. Very, very treacherous. We'll go to the next slide. And that's a better shot here. That shows you what it looks like in the rainy season. There's a railroad bridge and footbridge, the only way you can get to Belle Isle. Private Dorrance Atwater. Of course, he survived Andersonville, but he had a good dose of what prison's like being confined down here. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, the Confederate guards at Belle Isle, interesting observations. An island in the middle of these treacherous waters of the James River, and they had no walls around it. And not only that, they had no buildings to house the prisoners. They just had tents. That was it. And of course, Richmond's a lot further north than Andersonville, and it's a lot colder in the winter there. And that was a huge problem. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is an incredible picture. Some of the Union prisoners, you can see they were in a, almost like a crater type of thing where they had, and you can see up on the top of the rim of the crater, all the rebel soldiers were there with their cannons and everything. And that's where they lived. But the problem, they said, they had shelter for tents, that's it, in the winter. And they said every day, at least 10 or 12 Union soldiers in the winter were dying just because they froze to death. So we'll go to the next slide. So Belle Isle at that time, and the war continued after 5 months, Dorrance Atwater was confined there, was overcrowded. So what they did was they took the Union prisoners, a lot of them, loaded them onto boxcars, and sent them down to Andersonville Prison. That's how Dorrance Atwater got there. And of course, the soldiers at the time thought this was great. It's going to be a brand new prison that they just did in Georgia. We don't have to worry about the cold winters or living in tents or anything. They look forward to getting out of Belle Isle. And we can see, as I continue on here, what a mistake that was. We'll go to the next one. Now, we're going to cover another soldier, Private James Chapman, who was in the 11th Connecticut Infantry. And he actually also survived Andersonville. And this is a story of Drury's Bluff. It's called Fort Darling, Virginia. May 16th, 1864 was the battle. But we're going to show it's one of the cannons. They had these cannons that are protecting Richmond, when the James River went up to Richmond. And this was a fort protecting Richmond. And we'll go to the next slide. And these are tremendous pictures here. What they did early, on May 16th, the Union Ironclad ships, they sent all these Ironclad ships up. And up the river, which was great because they had, didn't have a large draft or anything. They could go right up the river, perfect, with all their cannons on board. Unfortunately, on the heights of this fort was 90 feet above the level of the river below, guarding Richmond. Now, if you take a look at these cannons, and if you take a look, especially the one on the monitor on the right, even though they sent up a fleet of these boats, there's nothing they could do about it. They can't elevate the guns. They're perfect if it's ship to ship or something like that. but they were completely useless in this attack. So the Confederates won this first battle May 16, 1862, very early in the war. We'll go to the next slide. Now, this was amazing. This is a great picture there. You can see here's the fort, 90 feet above the river, and this whole fleet of ironclads, which were great because they had only, metal on the side of the ships. They weren't wooden ships, so they could deflect a lot of the shells, but they could not elevate to do anything like that. So the Confederate artillery, even though they only had 2 of these large cannons, actually saved Richmond, May 16, 1862, Drury's Bluff. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, this is interesting here. General Butler, this is actually 2 years later, and the Union has not been able to get an attack and capture Richmond. And so the Confederates now have really put a lot of fortifications and did a lot with this fort. And we're talking about Private James Chapman, who was assigned to the 11th Connecticut Infantry. And you can see there's actually today, that's what it looks like today, they actually have one of the cannons in the same position that they had back during that time of the battle. So General Butler, Union Army decided, we're going to make a big push here for Richmond. And so what they did is they got the 11th Connecticut Infantry with other groups, put them all under General Butler, and they all got together and they said, we're going to, instead of going up the James River, which was very unsuccessful 2 years ago, we've got a larger force than the Confederates, and we're going to attack this fort over land. It's going to be an overland assault. And they carefully planned it. And so Private Chapman from Connecticut was one of the soldiers there. And I might add, it's an interesting story when I get into the Andersonville story about what happened to him, but bottom line is he survived Andersonville. But what happened was they came up on the land with their whole force on the Confederates, and they attacked it, overwhelming force. But the Confederates prevailed. They actually went there, and they, with all their cannons, and was all reinforced now in Richmond 2 years later. And it was another huge win for the Confederacy. And captured, I guess we'll go to the next slide. Captured there, of course, was Private Chapman. And once again, they had quite a few captured, and what they did is they got to the nearest railroad depot, and they put a lot of the Union prisoners on the train and sent them all the way down south to Andersonville. And of course, everybody back then, the South figured that we've got a lot of small prisons throughout the South, but they're at full capacity, and that's why they wanted to create Andersonville. It was a great position to create it. It had a lot of wood, so they could make a great stockade, all the Georgia pines. They had a creek that flowed right through the whole area that they wanted to have. They mapped out a total of over 26 acres of land. It was warm. And so all these prisoners that were up around Virginia and some of these other places that were dying in the winter, they just thought that was the greatest thing at all, to come into Andersonville. Unfortunately, the South just kept on sending prisoners into Andersonville, one trainload after another trainload. Originally, it was only supposed to hold 10,000 and help relieve the other prisons, but they just kept on sending train after train in Andersonville completely overwhelmed it. And what I'm doing here is trying to give you an idea of a lot of these New England soldiers. How did they get there? That story probably is really not told in any detail. Very, very curious, especially with a lot of the New Englanders, or a lot of the families would certainly want to know this. And that's the reason I'm putting this whole presentation together, to sort of personalize it, so every stone really in Andersonville has a complete story. And as you can see, a lot of these soldiers were captured, not on famous battlefields either, not Gettysburg or some of the famous battles you would think of. A lot of them are on these small skirmishes. They were captured, and most of it happened during the time of the Civil War, when the South was winning a lot of the battles. So that's my presentation for episode 2. We're going to be covering more soldiers and see how they got down there to Andersonville. And once again, this is Dave Norton from Discovering New England History. Have a good evening.